Welcome to Faith Fellowship Baptist Church in Brandon, Manitoba. This morning's devotional, we're once again back in the Psalms, and we're looking at Psalm 5 this morning, a morning prayer for guidance and protection. It's divided up into 5 stanzas, and so I would call stanza 1 the desire of the prayer to be heard, verses 1 through 3. Many Psalms begin with this kind of appeal to the Lord. In verse 1, the writer David says, "Give ear to my words, O Lord." In verse 2, he says, "Give attention to my meditations or my cries." Psalm 34, verses 4 and 5, the writer there says, "I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears." Secondly, there's not only a keen desire to be heard, but there's a keen desire on the part of the prayer to know that I'm praying the right way. Sometimes in the middle of our prayer, we can sense that maybe we're not doing this right. There's a thought that comes across our mind that distracts us, and we get all flustered and in the middle of a prayer, and sometimes we have haunting questions that just unnerve us. And so we might ask ourselves, am I praying the right way? Well, consider the following statement that God answers our prayers in 3 ways: yes, no, and wait. And sometimes we have to recognize that our prayers are not answered because we're praying the wrong way, because we're asking for the wrong things, or because we're living the wrong way. Psalm 66 verse 18 says, "If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me." So Psalm 5 reads, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my groanings. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray." Verse 3, "O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I lay my requests before you and keep watch." David is not holding back. He has no qualms about bringing his needs boldly before the throne of grace. And so should I and you, in the spirit of which we should pray. We should have a sense of intensity. There should be a sense of genuineness or something above our careless speech or normal speech when we approach the throne of grace. Something in how I pray should demonstrate that I mean business when I'm talking to God, that I need to be here at this moment and I need to talk with him. David's prayer was not routine. None of his prayers were. It wasn't a memorized or traditional prayer. And we know what Jesus said about that in Matthew chapter 6. But also notice there's a growing intensity that the longer David prays, it seems, in many of his prayers, the closer he gets with the Lord and the more intense his words are. All of our prayers and words with God should, of course, be thoughtful and not careless. And sometimes they will grow in intensity as the time that we spend with him grows as we mature. So the spirit in which we pray should be thoughtful, genuine, and secondly, the spirit in which we pray should show that we have a respect for the one to whom we are praying. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 6 says, "Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." In Romans chapter 8 verse 15, we do have the privilege of coming before our Father, Abba Father, but even earthly fathers we must show respect and honor for. And so we know and speak to the one who is definitely higher than us. And then thirdly, the spirit in which we should pray should also have the characteristic of persistence. A regular practice, something that demonstrates that this is a regular dependence and sense of importance. And this is why we value the action of praying. David says, when he says in the morning, the Hebrew means as soon as the sun comes up, and every morning the sun comes up. Psalm 92 verses 1 and 2, "It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your steadfast love in the morning and your faithfulness each night." So fourthly, the spirit in which we should pray should also have a characteristic of expectancy, something that demonstrates our belief in the ability of God not only to hear, but also to answer. So in the end of verse 3, David says, "I not only lay my request before you, but I watch." I'm anticipating and eagerly awaiting your answer. James chapter 5 verses 17 and 18 gives us the example of Elijah, who was a man just like us. But how did he pray? James says he prayed earnestly that it would not rain and so on. And then he prayed earnestly again that it would rain. And the earnestly there is literally with prayer he prayed, conveying an intensity. And Elijah chose in his situation to trust the power of prayer. And that kind of prayer with a righteous man is powerful and effective. And then finally, in these first 3 verses, we need to recognize that when we pray, we must ensure that we do have a personal relationship with the one to whom we are praying. Notice that David just doesn't say Israel's God. He says, my God. Notice that he doesn't say just Israel's king, but he says, my king. Now in stanza 2, verses 4 through 6, we have the character of the God to whom we pray. Verse 4, for you are not a God that delights in wickedness, evil may not dwell with you. We need to know that God's opposed to all those who do evil and all the evil things that they do. God takes no pleasure in the wicked. The world has this sense that if you're okay and I'm okay with what you're doing, then we're all okay and God will be okay for us. You only have to read Romans 1:18 through 32 to know that we're not okay with the Lord. Romans chapter 1, verse 1 through 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so David, in these verses now 4 through 6, recognizes that he needs to be different. He needs to live a different lifestyle than those who don't know the Lord. And James Boyce writes very pointedly at this point. Let me quote him. He says, we take sin too lightly. If we did not, we would not sin as grievously or as frequently as we do. Someone told me recently, he writes, of a lapel button that reads, how much sin can you get away with and still go to heaven? He said, imagine a thought like that. The answer to that question is that you cannot get away with any sin. You must be holy. And the secret to being holy is to see sin as God sees it and to draw closer to him. Verses 5 and 6, the boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those, verse 6, who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloody and deceitful man. Again, the emphasis is in these verses, God does not take any pleasure in any kind of sin, wickedness, evil, or those who participate in such actions or attitudes. Stanza 3, verses 7 and 8 says, it's the character of the one who prays. David says, but I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter into your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you. David says, but as for me, in contrast to the wicked, I will come. I have made a conscious, deliberate decision to come and worship the Lord. Psalm 122, verse 1 says, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go up to the house of the Lord. In Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Now, I know at this particular time, we're trying to do our best to assemble together because of COVID-19. So we have to be a little creative in some ways, but we're looking forward to that day when we get back together and we can rejoice and celebrate face to face. David says, I will enter your house not because of my own goodness, but because of your mercy. And the Hebrew word there is hesed, God's covenant, faithfulness, and long-suffering nature with those who are his own. Coming into God's house or into his presence is probably the highest privilege that mankind has with God, venturing into the presence of God in the context of fellowship, not judgment. So it's important for us to know and understand that no one comes before the Lord except by his mercy. If you have time, read the story of the publican or the Pharisee and the publican in Luke chapter 18, verses 11 through 14, and the difference in terms of their attitude and who Jesus said ended up leaving righteous. Verse 8, lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies, David writes. Make your way straight before me. And if God doesn't lead him, David is saying, I'm concerned. I'm fearful because I can't trust those around me. He said that basically in Psalm 1, verse 1. Don't listen to the advice of the ungodly or the unsaved or the wicked. He needed and he prayed right now that the Lord would protect him and make his way straight. And then stanza 4, verses 9 and 10, we have the character of those who oppose God and who oppose the righteous. David writes, for there's no truth in their mouth. Their inward self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongues. There's nothing dependable that comes out of the mouth of an unrighteous person. They're not accountable to the Lord, so why should they care what they say? In verse 10, make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels because of the abundance of their transgression. Cast them out, for they have rebelled against you. David prays, declare them guilty, pronounce them guilty. Let them be dealt with as they have so richly merited. Let them reap what they sow. This phrase, let them fall by their own counsels, I have prayed many times toward those who would seek to destroy God and God's kingdom and God's righteous rule. And if we are to pray, thy kingdom come and thy will be done, then anything that opposes that is unrighteous and God will not stand for it. And so it's not a request based on the fact that it's not a mean-spirited request or a vicious or vengeful request. It's simply a request by David based on the fact that these folks have rebelled against the Lord. The chief reason or that he argues for is that the Lord needs to judge them in his righteousness, And lest we be too haughty and high-minded of ourselves, we know that all of us stand before the Lord in need of judgment. But by grace and because of his forgiveness, we can have a righteous relationship with the Lord. But we need to pray that it would be so, that the Lord would stand for justice, and that's what we pray. We'll come back to Psalms like this in the future, what we call imprecatory Psalms, because they are difficult to understand. But James Boyce again writes, in this case, it is necessary to note only that David's vexation with the wicked is not personal. A few people in the Bible are more forgiving in response to personal attacks than David. Rather, his concern is that they have rebelled against God, like Psalm 2. And his request is that God condemn them for their sin. It's exactly the kind of prayer that we should be able to pray when we see the effects of sin in our fallen world. Well, stanza 5 in conclusion is God's blessing on those who take refuge in him. It's the blessing of those who seek refuge and protection from God himself. Verse 11, but all those who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them sing and shout for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. Believers rejoice in justice. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people grieve. Forever we want to rejoice with that forever kind of joy, because God protects those who seek protection from him. And then finally, verse 12, for you bless the Lord, O righteous. You bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. The righteous hope in the Lord because they know he will hear this kind of prayer. And God is a God who always blesses righteous people. He's willing and wanting to protect his own, because they seek in him a place of refuge, and they pray to him, and they rejoice in him. All of us, like David, experience moments when the evil surrounding us seems more than we can bear. That's precisely why we need a renewed vision of the greatness of God and the powerful protection that is available to those who would simply call on his name.